guys, how's it going? Laura with Garden Answer. Today I want to give you some simple steps on how you can start fall crops in containers. And I'm really excited for this because yesterday it was 97 degrees out. Today the high is 82. It's feeling super great out here, so I'm kind of feeling the fall vibe a little bit. So I want to give this to you in 10 really easy steps. The first one is to determine what fall crops you can grow in your area. So typically planting fall crops is like a repeat of what you planted in spring. They're crops that prefer cooler weather and temperatures. That's where they flourish and produce the best. We'll go ahead and flash a list of the most commonly grown crops in my area up on the screen, so feel free to pause the video, check that list out. But if you live in a zone colder than a 4 or higher than a 6, I would check with your local garden center to ask them what you should be starting this time of year and when you should be starting them. I'm pretty comfortable with zones 4 through 6 because that's what we deal with in our area. I live in a zone 5. But I don't grow in any other zones than that, so I don't know quite, the nuances that you guys might have in your area. So definitely check with your local garden center. So today what I'm going to be planting, in this container I'm going to plant some snap peas, cilantro, and then in the 2 galvanized tubs up here I'm going to plant beets and carrots. And then I'm going to start a few things in just peat pots, like little starter pots inside. So broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage. Those 3 prefer to germinate in cooler temperatures. Still pretty warm out here. If it were maybe in the low 70s-ish, I would feel more comfortable. Those 3 just don't tend to germinate as good in warm temperatures. So if I start them inside, get them going, then when the temperatures cool off here pretty consistently, I can bring them out here and transplant them into their own containers. Step number 2 is to figure out your average first frost date. It's super easy. Go ahead and ask somebody at your local garden center, or you can Google it. That's what I did. I just typed in first average frost date and then my zip code, and it brought up all the information I needed. So in my area, our first average frost date is typically right around October 1st. It can happen anywhere between September 15th and October 15th, which means we can pretty much take the average at October 1st. But living here, I know that we usually have longer falls that are pretty warm, so I have a couple week buffer there, I think. So now that you know the crops you have in your average first frost date, so let's say you have a carrot that's a 65-day maturity. So you need to count back 65 days from that first average frost date, and then you can kind of know the range where you need to start those carrots. So like today I'm planting all the things I already listed, and then in a few weeks I'll start my lettuce, spinach, kale, and radishes. Those prefer even cooler temperatures than we're getting right now, and they're quicker growing, so I can start those a little bit later and they'll be a lot happier. Step number 3 is to choose the correct container size. So I'm growing a mixture of things that both produce their crop up above the soil, like my peas and cilantro, and then I'm growing some beets and carrots, which are also called root crops, which produce their crop below the soil. So it's especially important to choose the right container size when growing root crops, because let's say you choose a carrot that wants to get 10 inches long. You want to make sure that the container that you choose is at least 10 inches or more deep so that your carrot can form properly and will be a lot healthier. And then for like my cilantro, which I'm going to be growing in this container right here, it's a lot more shallow, but like I said, it's producing what I want to harvest off of it on the top of the soil. So I don't need to worry so much about having a ton of root space. I just want to have enough space on top so that it can produce its leaves really nicely and be a nice healthy crop. Step number 4 is to choose your soil, and I would recommend using a really loose, well-draining potting soil. I'll show you what I'm going to use. Let me grab it. So this is Espoma Organic potting soil. Something like this works great for a planting project like this, especially for the root crops. You want to have something that's loose and well-draining so that water isn't being held around those roots so that you don't deal with rot. It also helps the vegetable form a really nice shape. So like sometimes when you're planting root crops in the ground, if you have really heavy clay soil or rocky soil, sometimes they can have a really hard time forming a nice shaped vegetable. They'll come out a lot of the time really weird shaped, but if you have a really nice loose soil, they can form that really nice typical carrot shape. Oftentimes you can find bags of soil in a lot of different sizes, and I prefer smaller bags because they're so much easier to move around. Step number 5 is to use a starter fertilizer to mix it in the soil. I'm using an organic biotone starter from Espoma. Whatever you use, you just want to make sure, number 1, it's a starter fertilizer so it's not too hot that it won't burn your seedlings. And I prefer to use an organic fertilizer over a synthetic because they break down slower. It's a slower feed for your plants. And that's especially important when you're gardening in containers because the only nutrients these plants are getting are what you give it. They can't draw it from any reservoirs in the soil around them. So I just like knowing that the organic fertilizer is just slowly feeding these plants. Once the vegetables are up and growing a little bit, probably in a month and a half, I'll go in with a little bit of garden tone, which is kind of like an all-purpose organic vegetable food, and I'll sprinkle a little bit around each vegetable, work it in, and that should get them through the whole season. So to apply this, I'm just going to put a few handfuls on the top of each one of these containers, and then I'll work it into about the top 4 to 6 inches of soil. There is directions on the back, a guideline on how much to use per container. If you're a beginner, I would recommend following those directions until you get kind of a feel for how much you should be using, and then it just kind of becomes second nature. Step number 6 is to moisten the soil, and you want to do this before you plant your seeds. And this is a pretty important step because what it does is by adding water in now, it helps settle the soil so that when you put your seeds in and then water them back in when you're done planting, it doesn't dislodge your seeds all over the place. So to do that, I'm just going to use my hose, which I've got a water wand with a water breaker on the end. This one is a 1000 water breaker, which means there's 1000 tiny little holes on the end of this nozzle, which helps break the water stream up. And that way, when I water my seeds in later, it's a really soft stream and it also won't dislodge my seeds all over the place. So what I'm going to do is just water the soil in, mix it in with my hands really well, and then we can start planting. Step number 7 is to plant your seeds. And this is where you want to look at the back of the seed package because there's a lot of good information on the back. You want to look at what the recommended seed depth is to plant, and this one is a 1 inch deep. These are Sugar Daddy snap peas. And then it also recommends how far to space them apart. So it recommends about 2 inches. So I know when I go in to plant my peas, I need to do a hole approximately 1 inch deep about every 2 inches. And then I'm gonna drop a couple of seeds down into each hole. So step number 8 is to cover over your seedlings to the recommended depth. So we've already made our holes 1 inch deep. So what you can do this 2 ways. You can just go in and just take your fingers and cover over the holes just like this, really easy. Or you can mix up a little bit of extra soil in an extra bucket, get it moist, and then you can just cover over the holes with that soil. I prefer this method because it's a lot faster. All done with the peas, so now I'm gonna plant just regular cilantro in this container. I'm planting Chantenay carrots called Short Stuff in this galvanized tub here, and then beets called 5 Color Rainbow in that tub there. So I'll get those all planted and covered over, and then we'll move on to the next step. Step number 9 is to water them all in really well, and then you want to make sure to keep them well watered until they germinate, because once you get that seed wet, you cannot let it dry out or else you lose your germination. And the last step, step number 10, is to thin your seedlings. This is a super important step, one that I can't show you in this video. I think we'll probably be doing an update video to show you this step more close up. But once your seeds have all germinated, since we planted more than 1 seed in each hole, we need to go through and thin out the weaker looking seedlings and leave the really strong healthy ones in there, and that way it leaves plenty of room for all the plants to grow up big and healthy, so they have enough room for their roots and enough airflow around each plant so that they're all happy. And the last thing I wanted to mention, and this doesn't matter until way later on in the season, and it may not even matter in your growing zone, but in those areas that get colder a little earlier, or those areas where you can get a really weird cold snap come through that you weren't expecting, it's really nice to have a piece of Harvest Guard available. It's just a really, really lightweight fabric that you can protect your vegetables with. So if you have things growing that are still producing, or they're about ready to produce, and all of a sudden you get this scare for a frost, you can really easily cover your crops and protect them and actually buy yourself quite a bit of time with something like this. And it's really easy to use. All you have to do is drive like 4 stakes right on the inside of each container, put a piece of the fabric over and weight it down with rocks around the exterior of the container. And if you do that every night, you protect your crops and you buy yourself quite a bit of time. So it's always nice to have a piece of this around just in case. So those are the 10 steps on planting fall crops in containers. I really hope this video is helpful to you guys. And like I said earlier, there are 3 other ones I'm going to be starting today. There are cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli. And I'm starting these in little Jiffy seed starting peat pots inside because these particular crops do not prefer, like they don't germinate very well when it's still really warm outside, and we still have some temperatures in the 90s coming. So the steps are exactly the same. I'm going to be mixing soil and fertilizer in this container, getting it moist, and then I'll add it to these pots, plant my seeds, and then they'll be going inside underneath a grow light. As soon as they're germinated and grown on and it's consistently cooler out here, I can just bring these out, pop the whole pot and all down in a container. This biodegrades. It kind of just dissolves, and they can just grow on containers. So that's the only difference there. So that's it, you guys. I'm really excited about this project, excited to see these things grow and have a new fresh crop of produce coming off this late summer, early fall. I would love to know what you guys are growing in your gardens. Leave me comments down below. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.